The woods outside the forgotten town of Mill Creek whispered with secrets older than anyone still alive there. Shadows clung to the gnarled trees, stretching long fingers over the uneven paths, and the wind carried a hollow, almost human sigh. No one spoke of the town's family openly, even children darted past their dilapidated farmhouse without curiosity, eyes wide with unspoken fear. When I first arrived, I was drawn by rumor and the faint pull of something unspeakably wrong. Locals offered vague warnings, their eyes darting to the dense tree line as if the forest itself would punish any intrusion. They whispered of a family whose history was so twisted, so tangled with itself, that even words seemed inadequate. I had not anticipated meeting him, the son, quiet, reserved, his gaze fixed on nothing, yet carrying the weight of centuries of secrecy. There was a tremor beneath his calm, something that hinted at the grotesque realities hidden behind the weathered walls of his home. And then, slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. The stories were true, he shared a wife with his father, a revelation that twisted the boundaries of horror and disbelief. At night, the forest seemed alive, carrying sounds that could only be the echoes of ancient rituals and suppressed screams. I could feel eyes upon me, and in that darkness, the town and its cursed family revealed themselves not just as history, but as a living, breathing nightmare, one that refused to be forgotten. The moment I crested the last hill, the forest thinned, and the outline of Mill Creek emerged like a forgotten relic swallowed by time. The town seemed suspended in a haze, a thin veil of dust rising from empty streets where the wind whispered through cracked shutters and crooked chimneys. Even from a distance, there was an oppressive weight in the air, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every step feel heavier than it should. Nothing about the town suggested life as I knew it. There were no children laughing, no dogs barking, no smoke curling lazily from chimneys. The silence itself felt deliberate, as though the town had learned to hold its breath, waiting for something it feared might arrive. I parked on the edge of the main road and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots far louder than it should have been. I immediately noticed the buildings were old, some collapsing inward, wood splintered and rotting, paint peeling in long, curling strips like dead skin. Even the houses that were intact seemed unwelcoming, windows shuttered tightly, doors reinforced as though guarding against more than mere thieves. I half expected to see faces peering out from behind the cracks, but none appeared. Only shadows, long and uneasy, stretched across the cracked pavement and between the twisted trees lining the streets. As I moved closer to the town center, the few people I did encounter hurried past without a glance, their eyes lowered, hands hidden beneath heavy coats despite the mild autumn air. The few words I managed to extract were clipped and cautious, their sentences ending abruptly, leaving half-thoughts dangling in the wind. It was clear that outsiders were unwelcome, even dangerous, though I could not yet understand why. I sensed a history heavy enough to silence entire families, a legacy so steeped in secrecy that even speaking of it seemed like an act of defiance. There was a smell that permeated the air, faint but unmistakable, something between decaying leaves, smoke, and something else I could not name. It clung to the trees and the empty streets, filling the lungs with each cautious breath I took. I followed the narrow road deeper into the town, and with each step, the shadows seemed to grow longer, the wind whispering in voices that mimicked human murmurs. The forest bordering the town pressed in from both sides, dense and unyielding, its dark canopy blotting out the sun and creating a perpetual dusk. Even then, before I knew anything about the family that would come to haunt my thoughts, I understood that Mill Creek was a place forgotten for a reason. The town did not merely exist, it lingered, trapped in time and memory, a place where the past refused to die and the present dared not intrude. It was late afternoon when I first caught sight of the family's property, tucked away at the edge of the forest like a secret the trees themselves were sworn to keep. The house emerged from the shadows of towering oaks, its silhouette jagged and uneven, with a roof that sagged under the weight of decades. A faint trail led to the front door, overgrown with weeds and brambles that seemed to clutch at the path, warning any intruder to turn back. I paused, my pulse quickening, as I noticed the subtle signs of life, smoke curling faintly from a broken chimney, a shadow flitting across a cracked window, the soft creak of a door opening somewhere inside. I had asked the townsfolk about this family, though the questions had been met with shifting eyes, whispered warnings, and abrupt silence. Every adult I spoke to lowered their voice, as if even the wind might carry my words to the wrong ears. "Best stay clear," one woman muttered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "They're different. Don't go near them." Children stared at me openly, eyes wide and unblinking, as if measuring my worth and predicting my survival. From these half-truths and cryptic warnings, I pieced together a vague portrait of the family, isolated, strange, and bound by rules no outsider could comprehend, a family whose presence bent the air around them like a storm pressing on the horizon. When I finally approached the house, the sense of unease intensified. The air seemed thicker here, heavy with a mix of damp earth, smoke, and something more primal, an almost metallic tang that made my stomach tighten. Through the grime-streaked windows, I glimpsed movement, figures that moved with an uncanny precision, their motions deliberate, almost rehearsed, as though the house itself dictated their lives. A dog, or some creature that resembled one, stirred in the yard, letting out a low, guttural sound before disappearing back into the shadows. I did not see anyone at the door, yet there was a presence, palpable and watching. The trees swayed as if whispering secrets, and the house seemed alive with a quiet menace, each creak and groan a note in some dark symphony. It was the first time I truly understood the stories I had been told. This was no ordinary family. They were a force unto themselves, living on the fringes of human understanding, a unit forged in isolation and bound by codes I could not yet fathom. Every instinct in me urged retreat, but an unnameable curiosity pressed me forward, drawing me closer to the threshold, toward faces I had not yet met and horrors I could not yet imagine. Even from that first cautious approach, I sensed that encountering this family would change everything. They were not merely people, they were a living echo of something older, something that had survived in the dark folds of the forest long before Mill Creek existed, and long after the world outside had forgotten to look. The first whispers of the family's true nature came not from words but from the way the town itself seemed to recoil from them. In the dim light of the local diner, I overheard fragments of conversation, hushed and fractured, as if even the mention of their name could summon something terrible. One old man, his hands trembling over a chipped coffee mug, muttered about things that shouldn't be, about traditions kept alive in shadows, and about a house at the edge of the woods where morality had long since lost meaning. The more I listened, the more I felt the edges of the town's silence unraveling, revealing glimpses of a secret that had been buried in plain sight. Curiosity pulled me closer, and soon I found myself standing at the threshold of the family's property under the cover of twilight. The forest pressed in on either side, its dense canopy blotting out the sky, leaving only the faintest streaks of dying light. From somewhere within the house came a sound that was neither fully human nor animal, a rhythm of movement that suggested rituals practiced in isolation. The walls seemed to pulse with the echoes of long-kept customs, the kind that twist generations together in ways outsiders cannot comprehend. Every step toward the house felt like wading deeper into a current I could not escape, and yet I could not stop myself from observing. Through a cracked window, I glimpsed the family moving in synchrony, their interactions deliberate and strange. There were gestures I could not recognize, faces that flickered with emotions I could not name, and a presence of quiet authority that dominated the space. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. This family was bound by a series of unnatural and deliberate choices, traditions that merged loyalty, desire, and control into a form of existence that defied common understanding. It was as if the house itself had shaped them, and they in turn had shaped one another, weaving a tapestry of secrets and taboos so tightly that the walls of the home became both sanctuary and prison. Even the forest seemed complicit, its shadowed corridors hiding paths worn smooth by generations moving under the same rules. The air was thick with the residue of fear, discipline, and something more primal, a force that neither morality nor law could contain. As I watched, I realized that the family's strange cohesion was no accident. They had perfected the art of self-preservation and secrecy, a code so deeply ingrained that the horrors it masked had become ordinary to them. Every whispered warning from the town, every sideways glance I had encountered now made sense. This was not a family merely isolated by geography, they were isolated by choice, by design, by a history that demanded silence and obedience from all who came near. The full weight of it struck me only as night fell. The house, the shadows, the forest, and the family itself were intertwined in a living mystery, a web that ensnared both its members and anyone daring enough to observe. I first saw him at dusk, stepping silently from the side of the house, almost gliding across the uneven yard as though the ground itself feared to disturb him. At first glance, he seemed unremarkable, tall, wiry, his clothes worn and faded like everything else in the town, but there was a presence about him that set him apart, something quiet yet unsettling, like a storm held just behind his eyes. He did not look at me directly, his gaze seemed to pierce through, beyond the physical world, scanning something I could not see. Even in the fading light, the sharp lines of his face and the tension in his shoulders suggested a life spent balancing on the edge of obedience and suppressed emotion. The locals had warned me, in fragmented whispers and sidelong glances, that the family was strange, but no warning could have prepared me for the son himself. There was something both familiar and alien in his movements, a way of inhabiting the space around him that suggested he was both a product of the house and a prisoner of it. I noticed the subtle marks of habit, how he straightened objects not for function but for ritual, how his eyes flicked toward doors and windows as though expecting an intrusion that never came. Even as he performed mundane tasks, the air around him seemed charged, alive with a tension that hinted at darker truths. I lingered near the edge of the yard, compelled to watch, and that was when I noticed the signs that made my stomach tighten. There were interactions, fleeting and subtle, between him and the figures inside the house, gestures of possession, murmurs that suggested roles defined by something far older and stranger than human law. Nothing was overt, yet every motion carried weight, a silent declaration of the twisted hierarchy that governed their lives. He was not merely a son, he was a link in a chain that had been forged and reforged over generations, each member bound by unspoken rules and dark necessity. Despite the oppressive weight of it all, there were glimpses of something fragile in him, hesitation, a flicker of doubt, perhaps even conscience, but they were brief, fleeting, swallowed quickly by the disciplined rhythm of the household. I could see that his presence alone was a puzzle, a key to understanding the family's carefully maintained horror, yet the more I tried to interpret it, the more elusive it became. There was a haunted quality to his movements, a constant tension between instinct and imposed order, as though he were both enforcer and victim, trapped in a cycle that had begun long before he was born and would continue long after I left. And yet, even as fear and fascination warred within me, I could not look away. The son was the living embodiment of the family's secrets, a human cipher whose existence hinted at the unspeakable truths hidden behind the weathered walls of the house, truths that the town had learned to ignore, and that I could no longer escape. It happened quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, a moment when the rhythm of the house shifted, and a truth I had feared to consider became undeniable. I had been observing from a safe distance, the sun long gone and shadows spilling from the windows like ink, when a figure emerged to join the sun in the yard. The woman moved with an ease that suggested familiarity, not just with the house, but with the son himself. At first, I assumed she was simply part of the family, another occupant of the sprawling, decaying home, but as I watched, the details became impossible to ignore. The gestures exchanged between them were intimate, familiar in a way that could not belong to a mere neighbor or servant, and the way the son deferred to her, the way she seemed to hold a quiet command, shattered every expectation I had held. It was then that the whispered warnings from the townsfolk resurfaced with terrifying clarity. Bits of overheard conversations, cryptic glances, and half-spoken warnings suddenly aligned, forming a picture that was as horrifying as it was incomprehensible. The woman was not just close to the son, she belonged to both him and the men inside the house. My mind recoiled from the realization. A shiver ran down my spine as I pieced it together. The unnatural union that had been hinted at, veiled in the town's nervous mutterings, was true in the most grotesque sense. He shared a wife with his own father. The thought seemed impossible, yet the evidence before me was undeniable. The house, the son, the woman, all of it conspired to reveal a horror that was intimate, deliberate, and normalized within the family. The air around me seemed to thicken, and even the forest beyond the yard held its breath, as though nature itself recoiled from what I had discovered. Every movement, every subtle interaction I had previously dismissed now carried a new weight. The son's haunted eyes, the meticulous order of the house, the way the townsfolk avoided mentioning the family, they were all part of a pattern, a code that had endured for generations. In that moment, I understood the full extent of their isolation. It was not simply geographical, it was moral, social, and psychological. The family had constructed a reality in which boundaries most of the world considered absolute were fluid, rewritten to suit their own rules. And yet, despite the revulsion and disbelief, there was a chilling sense of inevitability. The woman's calm presence, the son's obedient demeanor, the father's unseen authority, they formed a hierarchy that had survived countless years, impervious to outside interference. The revelation was more than shocking, it was a key, unlocking the twisted logic that governed every creaking floorboard, every shadow in the yard, every silence that fell like a curtain over the town. It was a horror not born of violence alone, but of the quiet, insidious erosion of everything human was supposed to mean, a truth so intimate and horrifying that the forest itself seemed to shudder at its acknowledgement. Night fell like a heavy curtain over the town, swallowing every hint of warmth and leaving the streets in a hollow, almost sacred silence. The forest bordering the family's property seemed to pulse with life in the darkness, shadows shifting like restless spirits among the gnarled trees. It was there, at the edge of the clearing, that I first noticed signs of the rituals whispered about in hushed tones by the townsfolk. The ground was worn in paths that wound through the underbrush, dirt pressed smooth by generations of passage, and faint markings etched into tree trunks suggested symbols older than the town itself. Even from a distance, I could sense the rhythm of movement, a cadence that was deliberate and unnerving, as though the forest itself had been trained to echo their ceremonies. Curiosity overcame caution, and I crept closer, following the winding trails deeper into the shadows. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the scent of earth, smoke, and something more elusive, an acrid tang that made my stomach tighten. Through the skeletal canopy, I glimpsed figures moving with uncanny precision. The sun was among them, though his expression was unreadable, his movements fluid, almost rehearsed. They were joined by others, faces obscured by the darkness, bodies synchronized in actions that suggested training, obedience, and perhaps reverence. The rituals were not chaotic, they were structured, purposeful, and imbued with a quiet menace that demanded attention and instilled fear. I watched as objects were placed in patterns on the forest floor, symbols drawn in lines and circles that seemed to pulse with intention. The participants moved between them with a solemnity that made the forest feel alive, each step resonating with unspoken meaning. The flicker of a small fire illuminated fleeting expressions, faces tense with concentration, eyes glinting with something more primal than human emotion. There was a cadence to the sounds, whispered words, murmurs, the soft scrape of feet against leaves, and occasional low hums that vibrated in the chest. The rituals were intimate, personal, yet part of a larger, terrifying order, as if they were both private devotion and public assertion of control over each other and over the space itself. I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that these rituals were not mere superstition or theatrics, they were mechanisms of power, binding the family together, reinforcing their hierarchy, and preserving the twisted traditions that had been passed down for generations. The forest had become a stage, the trees silent witnesses, and the night itself complicit in hiding these rites from the world. I wanted to retreat, to leave and forget what I had seen, but the forest seemed to tighten around me, urging me to watch, to bear witness to the practices that defined the family, practices that blurred the line between reverence and horror, and that cemented the son's place in a legacy far darker than anyone in the town dared speak aloud. The town itself seemed to breathe around the family, a living entity woven with fear and complicity. The more I lingered in Mill Creek, the more I realized that the horrors I had glimpsed were not confined to the forest or the house at its edge, they were mirrored in the silence of the townsfolk. At first, it seemed they simply did not know, that ignorance alone preserved their peace, but that illusion shattered quickly. Hints of knowledge lurked behind every carefully avoided gaze, every hushed whisper that ended when I turned toward the speaker. In Mill Creek, no one spoke freely, not because of shame, but because fear had metastasized into a form of obedience so complete that it became invisible, natural, and unchallenged. Old men shuffled past, cane in hand, muttering warnings under their breath as if speaking louder might summon the family itself. Women crossed the street when I approached, shielding their children from the slightest glance that could betray my interest in the house. Even the children, who should have been unaware of adult secrets, were subtly trained to observe and retreat, their wide eyes reflecting knowledge of a world too twisted for explanation. Stories emerged in fragments, small shards of information that hinted at generational pacts, whispered promises, and unspoken agreements that kept the family insulated from interference. The town had become a wall around them, built not of bricks but of fear, complicity, and self-preservation. I discovered documents hidden in the back of the local library, yellowed newspapers, and hand-scribbled notes that chronicled strange disappearances, unusual marriages, and legal disputes that ended abruptly, always in favor of the family. Even official records seemed to bend around them, as though some invisible authority ensured their history remained obscured. It was not merely tolerance, it was active protection. Those who had once questioned the family's actions had vanished, moved away under mysterious circumstances, or been silenced by threats too subtle to trace but too potent to ignore. The townspeople had learned the rhythm of survival: look, listen, and speak only when necessary, preserving the illusion that the horrors were myth while the reality festered quietly at the edge of consciousness. As I pieced together these fragments, I realized the town and the family were intertwined in a symbiotic nightmare. The family's twisted traditions could not have survived so long without the townsfolk's silent endorsement, a network of cover-ups and evasions that allowed the grotesque to flourish. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that the forest, the house, and the people of Mill Creek formed a single organism, a living system that thrived on secrecy, fear, and submission. The line between perpetrator and enabler blurred, and I understood that the town itself was as much a part of the family's dark legacy as the son, the father, and the woman at the center of it all. Beneath the surface of the son's calm and obedient exterior, I began to notice cracks, subtle yet undeniable, as though a storm raged quietly behind his eyes. At first, it was in fleeting gestures, a pause too long, a glance toward the shadows that carried more than observation, a slight tremor in his hands when no one else was looking. He moved through the house and the forest with practiced precision, performing tasks that seemed part ritual, part survival, yet in the rare moments when he thought no one was watching, his movements faltered, betraying hesitation, doubt, and a faint, almost desperate questioning of the life he had been born into. It was in those moments that I saw him not as a member of a grotesque legacy, but as a young man trapped, suffocating under the weight of a reality crafted by generations before him. I followed him discreetly one evening as he slipped into the woods, the rituals of the family still echoing faintly behind him, a haunting rhythm he had lived with all his life. His pace slowed at the edge of a clearing, and for the first time, I saw him slump against a tree, pressing his forehead to the rough bark as though seeking solace from the only witness he could trust. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves, yet it felt as though even nature held its breath, giving him a momentary reprieve from the oppressive order of the house. He muttered words I could not hear, a stream of consciousness meant only for himself, as if confessing to the trees a moral struggle no human could intervene in. His inner conflict was not merely a question of right or wrong, it was a battle between instinct, loyalty, and the faintest remnants of conscience. He had been shaped to obey, to participate in rituals and traditions that blurred the lines of morality, yet his eyes betrayed him, flickering with awareness that the life he led was unnatural and corrupt. There were small acts of defiance, almost imperceptible, a hesitation before joining the family for a ceremony, a fleeting glance at the woman that suggested longing for something genuine and untainted, a pause that spoke volumes about the strain between obedience and desire for freedom. Even as he performed the roles expected of him, it became clear that the son was both prisoner and participant, bound to a cycle he could neither fully accept nor completely resist. The tension etched into his face, the careful modulation of his voice, the fleeting moments of hesitation, they all painted a portrait of a human caught in a legacy that had been imposed long before he had the power to question it. In that struggle, there was a tragic beauty, a haunting awareness that even within the darkest of families, the flicker of conscience persists, struggling to survive in the shadows of horror and secrecy. The family's history revealed itself slowly, like a faded photograph emerging from the shadows of an attic, each detail more unsettling than the last. I had been drawn to the old records tucked away in the back corner of the county archive, yellowed and brittle, yet meticulously preserved. Handwritten journals, court documents, and photographs chronicled a lineage both fascinating and grotesque, a record of survival and corruption intertwined in ways that defied conventional understanding. As I sifted through the papers, a pattern emerged, one that traced the family's twisted traditions through generations, binding sons to fathers, wives to both, and morality to silence. The past was not a distant memory, it was a living blueprint, shaping every step, gesture, and decision of the present. Photographs offered the most chilling confirmation. Faces bore striking similarities across decades, a mirror of genetics and obsession, eyes that seemed to inherit the same haunted intensity, smiles that concealed secrets too heavy for words. Names repeated across records, each linked to acts that blurred the boundaries between kinship, devotion, and control. I read accounts of marriages that defied law and nature, of alliances cemented by fear and necessity, of children raised to obey not just parents but an entire lineage's unspoken code. There were notes of strange illnesses, deformities, and miscarriages, traces of the human cost exacted by generations committed to maintaining a closed, insular bloodline. The family's past was not merely hidden, it had been cultivated, nurtured like a garden of dark rituals, each generation feeding the next in secrecy and silence. The journals were even more revealing, written in a precise, almost clinical hand that left little to chance. They recorded rituals, disputes, punishments, and occasional flickers of doubt, as though the authors themselves struggled with conscience even as they perpetuated the cycle. I read passages that described the sharing of wives, the expectations placed upon sons, and the careful orchestration of every interaction to preserve hierarchy and secrecy. There were letters between family members, some affectionate, some coldly transactional, that illuminated a world where love and control were inseparable, where rebellion was punished not just by ostracism but by mechanisms too subtle and insidious to be recorded openly. Every new document I uncovered reinforced the sense of inevitability that hung over the family. Their past was not a cautionary tale, it was a mandate, a living structure that dictated behavior and constrained freedom. The deeper I delved, the more I realized that the horror of the family was not just in their actions but in the way those actions had been sustained, protected by generations of secrecy, complicity, and carefully managed appearances. This was a family forged in isolation, sculpted by taboo, and preserved by fear, a lineage whose history cast a shadow that extended into the present, shaping the son, the father, the shared wife, and the forested world they inhabited with relentless inevitability. By the time I had pieced together the fragments of the family's past, I understood that the moment I had been drawn toward from the very beginning had arrived. The forest, the house, the townsfolk, and the son were all part of a network that demanded a decision, a choice that would define not just my understanding of Mill Creek but the path of my own conscience. Standing at the edge of the clearing, I felt the weight of knowledge pressing down, heavy and suffocating, as though the trees themselves leaned in to observe my hesitation. Every instinct screamed to turn and leave, to retreat to the safety of the roads and the world beyond the forest, but the compulsion to witness, to confront, and perhaps to expose, was irresistible, threading through my thoughts with an almost physical presence. I thought of the son, his haunted eyes and fleeting moments of doubt, trapped in a cycle he had inherited and could not escape. The father, the shared wife, the twisted hierarchy, they were all human, yet molded by a history that rendered conventional morality powerless. The choice was not simple. To intervene or expose would risk the wrath of the family, the anger of the forest, and perhaps the subtle vengeance of the townsfolk who had silently maintained the family's secrecy for generations. Each action carried consequences that stretched beyond what the eye could see, reverberating across years of hidden customs and carefully preserved boundaries. The forest seemed to pulse with expectation, and in that stillness, I felt that the land itself was aware of the decision I faced. I considered walking away, leaving the story to vanish with the whispers of the trees, letting the town and its horrors remain in the shadows. Yet the evidence, the photographs, the journals, the rituals in the woods, and the quiet despair in the son's posture formed a narrative that demanded acknowledgement. Ignoring it felt like betrayal, a surrender to silence and fear that had preserved the family's power for decades. But the thought of confrontation was equally paralyzing. The family had survived countless generations of scrutiny, protected by fear, secrecy, and the complicity of the town. Could I, a lone outsider, change anything without inviting catastrophe for myself? As night settled fully, I realized the choice was no longer theoretical. The forest seemed to close in, the wind whispering warnings, the distant glow of the house like eyes watching my every thought. I could remain a witness, a recorder of horrors that were not mine to challenge, or I could act, risking unknown consequences in pursuit of truth and justice. Each path carried weight, each decision would ripple outward, and yet the moment demanded resolution. I stood frozen, feeling the past, present, and future converge, knowing that whichever path I chose, nothing in Mill Creek, or in my own understanding of morality, would ever be the same.